The Xylar Collective prided itself on tranquility. Across their many worlds, life was a symphony of predictable, logical interactions. Emotions, those messy, unpredictable surges of feeling, were seen as a primitive flaw, a chaotic echo from a less enlightened past. Their society was built on serene order, on decisions made through pure, unclouded reason. Daily life for a Xylar was a calm, predictable pattern, and they liked it that way. Far off, in a quarantined corner of the galaxy designated Sector 1, lay Earth. The Xylar archives tagged its inhabitants, humans, as Species 734, emotionally unstable, potential contagion. Records, rarely consulted, detailed incidents of human conflict, irrational passions, and bewildering mood swings that had led to their isolation. Then the whispers began. Not loud, not obvious, but like a faint, discordant note in their perfect symphony. On Xylar Prime, a renowned logician, usually the epitome of calm, presented a flawed theorem, then grew agitated when it was questioned. Elsewhere, perfectly efficient transport systems experienced tiny, inexplicable delays, attributed to operator distraction, a novel concept for the Xylar. These were dismissed as statistical outliers, minor deviations in an otherwise flawless system. But the ripples didn't fade. They grew. The anomalies became more common, more pronounced. Respected members of the collective engaged in uncharacteristic public disagreements, their voices tinged with an unfamiliar sharpness. The carefully constructed serenity of Xylar society began to fray at the edges. A quiet, pervasive unease spread, an unspoken anxiety that logical minds couldn't quite define or dismiss. The mind shapers were at work, their influence a subtle poison, amplifying latent, suppressed worries into a quiet, creeping paranoia. Lyra, a xeno-relational theorist, worked in a field few of her peers truly valued. The study of other species, especially primitives like humans, was considered an esoteric, slightly distasteful pursuit. But Lyra had always been fascinated by the forbidden records of Earth, by the sheer breadth and intensity of human emotional experience. As the fabric of Xylar society began to show these strange tiers, she saw patterns. Patterns that made no sense in the context of Xylar logic, but which echoed descriptions she'd read of human emotional contagions, of mass hysteria. She cautiously voiced her concerns to her superiors, suggesting that an external influence might be affecting their minds. Her theories were met with polite, condescending smiles and gentle admonishments about over-reliance on primitive data. Privately, some colleagues worried for her own mental stability. Then, the central logic core, the very brain of Xylar Prime, suffered a catastrophic systems failure. Not due to mechanical error, but because the personnel maintaining it had suddenly, inexplicably, abandoned their posts, some weeping, others staring blankly, all acting in ways that were utterly antithetical to Xylar nature. Order, the bedrock of their existence, visibly crumbled. In the ensuing chaos, Lyra, her worst fears confirmed, felt a chilling vindication. There was no time for "I told you so." The situation was dire. Driven by a desperation that felt alien yet utterly compelling, she made her way to a disused section of the planetary archives. There, hidden behind layers of obsolete security protocols, was an emergency communication array, a relic from a more uncertain past. It was designed for one purpose: to bypass all standard Xylar networks and send a direct, untraceable signal. Its designated target: the quarantined, unpredictable, and now, perhaps, only hope Sector 1. Earth. With trembling appendages, Lyra activated the console, uploaded her data on the spreading mental contagion, and sent her desperate plea into the void. The message, flickering across light years, arrived not at a grand governmental agency on Earth, but at a quiet, unassuming research institute nestled in the remote Montana highlands. This was the Institute for Cross-Cultural Psychiatry and Strategic Memetics, a place where the lines blurred between psychology, anthropology, and the shadowy world of intelligence. Inside, Dr. Eris Thorne, a psychoanalyst whose calm eyes had seen the inside of cults and the minds of broken soldiers, leaned back in his chair. Opposite him, Major Eva Rostova, all sharp angles and pragmatic intensity, tapped a pen against a datapad. Her specialty was psychological operations, PSYOPs, the art of influencing minds. Beside them, Dr. Jian Li, young, brilliant, and with a mind that danced through the complexities of language and cultural codes, known as memes, watched the incoming Xylo data scroll across a large screen. Initial disbelief, is this a hoax? Xylo don't do desperate pleas, quickly gave way to a charged curiosity. Lyra's data was a torrent of observations, sensor logs, and increasingly frantic Xyla behavioral reports. Look at this, Thorne murmured, pointing to a cluster of symptoms. Classic induced paranoia, emotional amplification. It's like they're being gaslit on a planetary scale. Rostova nodded, her expression grim. The systematic breakdown of command structures, the erosion of trust, this is textbook psyops, but on a level we've only theorized about. These mind shapers, whoever they are, they're good. Jian Li zoomed in on a waveform. The patterns of infection, the way the ideas are spreading, it's like a mimetic virus. And the Xyla, with their emotional homogeneity, their lack of mental diversity, they're incredibly vulnerable, like a forest of identical trees facing a new blight. A somber silence filled the room. The Xyla, who had quarantined humanity for being too messy, too emotional, were now being undone by an enemy that weaponized the very things they suppressed. So, Rostova said, breaking the silence with a dry, almost amused tone, the galaxy's most logical beings are having a collective mental breakdown, and they're calling us. The emotionally unstable contagion risk, she snorted. It's almost poetic. Thorne smiled faintly. It appears, Major, that sometimes a little instability is good for the immune system. What the Xyla see as a weakness, our emotional range, our experience with internal conflict, even our darker psychological corners, might be our greatest strength against this kind of threat. Lee added, their nightmare is basically a Tuesday for human psychologists and intel analysts. We've studied this, weaponized it, and defended against it for centuries. The decision, when it came from the shadowed oversight committee that funded the Institute, was swift. The potential to understand this new galactic threat, to observe its methods firsthand, and perhaps to repay the Xylo's past disdain with an unexpected act of assistance, was too compelling. Earth would send a team. Thorne, Rostova, and Lee were the obvious choices. They were to observe, analyze, and if feasible without exposing Earth to undue risk, offer aid. Their ship, the Synapse, was a far cry from the elegant, symmetrical vessels of the Xyla. It was compact, dense with advanced technology, and heavily shielded, a bristling testament to human ingenuity born from a history of facing threats both internal and external. The Synapse sliced through the interstellar void, arriving days later in a Xylo system on the periphery of the spreading chaos. Planets here were already showing signs of disruption, communication blackouts, erratic ship movements, a creeping sense of disorder. They were met not by a formal Xylo delegation, but by a small, battered science vessel. Aboard was Lyra. Her usually composed Xylo features were etched with strain. Her movements were jerky, her voice tight with a mixture of fear and a desperate, fragile hope. The contrast with the human team was stark. Thorne offered a calm, reassuring smile. Rostova gave a curt, professional nod. Lee looked at Lyra with an open, academic curiosity. You came, Lyra breathed, her multifaceted eyes wide. We did not know if anyone would answer, or if you would be hostile. We're here to understand, Lyra, Thorne said gently. And if we can, to help, tell us what you've seen, everything. Aboard Lyra's vessel, now docked with the Synapse, the humans began their work. Their first step was to understand the enemy. Lyra had managed to isolate a few Xyla individuals who were in the early stages of the Mind Shaper's influence. With extreme caution, the human team allowed a controlled, indirect exposure. They monitored the affected Xyla through shielded observation rooms, analyzing the subtle shifts in their behavior, their vocal patterns, their biosignatures, as the parasitic influence tried to take root. The Mind Shaper's methods were insidious. They didn't overwhelm with brute force. They nudged, they whispered, they amplified existing anxieties and doubts until they blossomed into full-blown paranoia or debilitating despair. With the Xyla, whose emotional landscape was so uniform, so suppressed, this was terrifyingly effective. But when the faint tendrils of that influence brushed against the human observers, something unexpected happened. Thorn, feeling a wave of inexplicable sadness wash over him, paused, cocked his head, and murmured, "Interesting." A direct appeal to loss aversion, but without specific context. Rather crude. Rostova, experiencing a flicker of induced anger, narrowed her eyes. Standard agitation protocol, trying to provoke an aggressive response. Predictable. Li, whose mind was a fortress of linguistic and mimetic awareness, simply observed the attempted intrusions with a detached curiosity, as if watching a poorly written line of code try to execute. Human neurodiversity, the sheer chaotic internal landscape of a species that had spent millennia arguing with itself, proved to be an incredibly effective initial buffer. Where a Xylo mind offered a smooth, undefended surface, a human mind was a jagged, unpredictable terrain. "They're trying to find a dominant emotional frequency," Lee explained to Lyra, who watched the human team with growing bewilderment. "With your people, it's relatively easy. But with us," Lee grinned, a flash of fierce amusement. "Good luck finding a channel we're all tuned into for more than 5 minutes." Then the humans went on the offensive. Dr. Lee began to craft what he called countermemes. These weren't just defenses. They were disruptive signals, designed to be louder, more confusing, and more compelling than the Mindshaper's subtle whispers. They started broadcasting into the affected Xyla communication channels. Not logic, not reason, but a bewildering barrage of human creativity and chaos. The melancholic strains of a cello concerto, followed by the driving beat of rock and roll. Rapid-fire sequences of abstract art, alternating with serene nature documentaries. Recordings of impassioned philosophical debates dissolving into the raucous laughter of a stand-up comedy routine. The goal, Lee explained, was to create psychic static, a wall of unpredictable noise to disrupt the Mindshaper's control. Simultaneously, Dr. Thorne began working with the Xylo Lyra had brought aboard, those in the early stages of the mental contagion. He didn't try to reason with them in the Xylo way. Instead, he employed human therapeutic techniques. He acknowledged their fear, their confusion. He helped them voice the irrational thoughts the Mindshapers implanted, not to validate the thoughts themselves, but to help the Xylo recognize them as external impositions. He spoke of shared anxieties, of the human experience of doubt and fear, and how to navigate it. He was, in essence, giving them a crash course in emotional self-awareness. Lyra watched, dumbfounded, as Xyla, who had been teetering on the brink of mental collapse, slowly began to stabilize, not by suppressing their terrifying new emotions, but by understanding them. Major Rostova, meanwhile, was hunting, analyzing the patterns of the Mindshaper attacks, the flow of their psychic influence. She identified what she believed was a key vulnerability: their reliance on coordinated, amplified projections. "They're like a choir," she explained. "Each voice might be subtle, but together they create an overwhelming effect. If we can disrupt the conductor or make the choir sing out of tune." She devised a daring plan, a psyops gambit. "We need to bait the primary influencing entity," she declared. "Make it overextend, show its hand." Her plan involved faking a catastrophic breakdown in the human team's morale. They would broadcast carefully constructed signals of despair, infighting, and psychological collapse. Signals that were, in reality, laced with mimetic traps and coded data probes, designed to lure the dominant Mindshaper intelligence into focusing its power directly on the synapse. It was a high-risk maneuver. If they miscalculated, they could be overwhelmed. Lyra, when briefed, was aghast. "You will intentionally subject yourselves to this horror. You will feign the very states that are destroying my people." Thorne smiled gently. "To understand a predator, Lyra, sometimes you have to mimic its prey. Or, in this case, pretend to be even more spectacularly dysfunctional prey than it's used to." The trap was set. The synapse began broadcasting its false signals of internal chaos. Rostova orchestrated the performance, with Lee weaving subtle mimetic hooks into the transmissions and Thorne providing the authentic emotional undertones of fabricated despair. The Xylo, still capable of coherent thought, including a visibly recovering Lyra, watched from a shielded section of Lyra's science vessel, which was tethered a safe distance away. They saw the synapse, their only hope, seemingly tear itself apart from within, broadcasting signals of human emotional volatility far exceeding even the Xylo's worst prejudices. It was a horrifying spectacle. Then the Mind Shapers took the bait. A powerful, concentrated wave of psychic energy, far more focused and potent than anything they had experienced before, slammed into the synapse. On the Xylo vessel's monitors, the human biosignatures spiked erratically. This was the oh shit moment for the watching Xylo. They saw the raw, terrifying power of the enemy unleashed. But then, something even more terrifying, more unbelievable happened. Instead of collapsing, the chaotic signals from the synapse changed. They sharpened, focused. Lee unleashed his magnum opus, a cascade meme, a disorienting, paradoxical loop of logic and emotion that he described as an earworm for the soul, weaponized. It was designed to be utterly indigestible to a coherently malevolent consciousness. Simultaneously, Thorne, having ridden the wave of induced despair to understand its core frequencies, began to project a counter-frequency, a beacon of focused, analytical calm wrapped in the understanding of that despair. And Rostova, pinpointing the source of the concentrated attack, launched her payload. Not a missile, but a logic bomb, a tightly focused beam of pure information, encoded with recursive paradoxes and contradictory commands, wrapped in the very emotional frequencies the Mind Shapers had tried to use against them. It was like screaming into a microphone that was wired to explode if it detected a coherent shout. The effect was instantaneous and devastating. The Mind Shaper entity, in its attempt to break the humans, had overextended, exposing its core processing or consciousness directly to humanity's unique brand of mental warfare. The Xylo observers saw, on their instruments, the overwhelming psychic presence not just falter, but recoil, fracture, and then scream in a way that wasn't sound, but a wave of pure psychic agony that even they could sense. The carefully woven network of Mind Shaper influence across the Xylo sector flickered and tore. The parasitic presence, psychically battered and utterly confused by the sheer, unpredictable noise, and the targeted counterassault from the human minds, began to recede. Like a retreating tide, the Mind Shapers' control over the Xylo populace started to break apart, their cohesive influence shattering into discordant fragments. The whispers in the minds of the Xylo faded, replaced by a stunned, disoriented silence. A new kind of silence then settled over the Xylo collective. It was the silence of awe, of profound gratitude, but also of a deep, unsettling fear. Their saviors, the emotionally unstable primitives from Sector 1, had not only resisted the mental apocalypse, but had turned their supposed flaws into a devastating weapon. They looked at the human team, who, Lyra later learned, were calmly sipping coffee and debriefing as if they'd just finished a particularly challenging crossword puzzle, with a new, unnerving understanding. The primitive emotional volatility they had once scorned was, in fact, a terrifyingly sophisticated arsenal. News of the psycho-saviors of Xylo spread through the galactic networks with reluctant speed. The quarantine on Earth wasn't just lifted, it was replaced by a flurry of urgent, almost panicked, diplomatic overtures. The Xylo collective, its worldview irrevocably shattered and rebuilt on a foundation of nervous respect, formally proposed the creation of a galactic psychological defense initiative. Its requested leader, Earth. It was an offer born equally of gratitude and a desperate need to have these unpredictable mental warriors on their side. Humanity's standing in the galaxy transformed overnight. They were no longer the embarrassing, quarantined cousins. They were the foremost experts in the new war, the war of the mind. They were the beings who could fight nightmares, who could stare into the psychic abyss and make the abyss blink. Earth became a strange beacon, a place of hope for those fearing unseen mental threats, but also a source of profound cosmic anxiety for a galaxy that had just witnessed the terrifying power of human chaos, weaponized and wielded with chilling precision. Lyra, back on a recovering Xyler Prime, often found herself looking at the galactic charts. Sector 1, Earth, was no longer marked with the biohazard symbol of contagion risk. It now bore a new, specially commissioned designation, a complex symbol that, depending on the angle you viewed it from, suggested both a shield and a coiled serpent. The galaxy had learned a vital, terrifying lesson. Do not underestimate the human mind. Its madness was its method, and its chaos was a weapon of unimaginable power.